The little black girl whispered to the biker she heard her mom crying beneath the cooling platforms last night. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into this heart-wrenching story. It was a warm summer evening when a little girl, no older than 8 or 9, dashed across the busy street towards the group of bikers who had just parked their motorcycles outside a local diner. Her eyes were wide with fear, her breath ragged, and her clothes were stained with dirt, as if she had been running for miles. The biker who noticed her first, a tall man with a thick beard and a leather vest that said Iron Riders on the back, stepped forward. He could tell something was wrong. As she approached, she grabbed the edge of his vest, her small fingers trembling. She whispered through her sobs, "Please, you have to help. They took my brother." The biker's eyes narrowed as he knelt down to her level, concerned but trying to stay calm. "Who took him, kid? What happened?" The little girl's voice cracked as she pointed down the alleyway, her tears mixing with the dirt on her face. "Two men. They grabbed him, and they put him in a car. I tried to stop them, but they just took him." Her words were rushed, almost incoherent, but there was enough urgency in her voice to make every member of the biker crew freeze. The man with the Iron Riders patch looked at the others. "We need to find this kid's brother, and fast. Get ready, we're going after them." As the bikers exchanged a look of determination, one of the younger men, who went by the name of Jax, grabbed his keys. "This isn't just some petty crime. We're talking about a kid who's in danger," he said. The tall man nodded, his eyes scanning the street. "No one hurts kids on my watch," he muttered. The bikers quickly mounted their Harleys, engines roaring to life. As they followed the girl's trembling finger towards the silver SUV she had described. As they sped through the streets, the sound of their motorcycles filled the night air, a low, rumbling chorus of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. But the girl wasn't done. As the bikers pushed forward, she gave them one more piece of information that made their hearts sink. "There's a sticker on the back of the car," she whispered. "A skull with snake eyes." The biker leader's eyes darkened. "The Serpents," he muttered under his breath, recognizing the symbol immediately. The Serpents were a notorious gang with a violent reputation, and the mention of their name made every rider on the team tense. This was no longer just a rescue mission. It was a full-blown conflict. The bikers sped through the streets with determination, their sights set on finding this little girl's brother and making sure that he was safe. The situation had just escalated. They knew the risks, but they were ready to face them head-on. This was about more than just loyalty to each other. It was about doing what was right. Iron engines roared as the bikers sped through the streets, the girl's shaking fingers still pointing towards the silver SUV. It was a tense ride, the wind whipping past them as the night sky darkened even further. The Iron Riders, a group of hardened men and women, were used to riding in storms and facing danger head-on. But this wasn't a usual run. This was personal. The little girl's desperate plea echoed in their minds. "They took my brother," she had said, and the urgency in her voice left no room for doubt. They had to act fast. As they reached the outskirts of town, the leader of the group, known as Hawk, made a sharp turn onto a dirt road, leading them further into the darkness. The headlights of the motorcycles illuminated the road ahead, but the shadows seemed to stretch on forever. The leader's mind raced. The girl had mentioned a sticker on the back of the car, a skull with snake eyes. It was a symbol that sent a chill down Hawk's spine. The Serpents. They were a gang no one dared to mess with, and the fact that they were involved meant this was no ordinary kidnapping. The bikers were well aware of the risks. They had dealt with dangerous people before, but never like this. Hawk tightened his grip on the handlebars, his eyes narrowing as the sound of the engines filled the air. They had no choice but to go after the Serpents now. As they sped along, Hawk glanced over at Jax, his second-in-command, who was riding just behind him. Jax was focused, his face set in determination. "We're going to find that boy," Hawk said, his voice calm but firm. Jax nodded without saying a word, the fire in his eyes speaking volumes. They had no time to waste. Minutes passed like hours, the sound of the motorcycles drowning out everything else as they pushed forward. The girl, now sitting at the front of Jax's bike, was still trembling, her small hands clutching tightly to his vest. Hawk could see the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else, a glimmer of hope. She was trusting them to bring her brother home, and they wouldn't let her down. As the riders approached the next intersection, Hawk signaled for a quick stop. The bikes screeched to a halt, and the riders dismounted, gathering in a tight circle around Hawk. "We need to make sure we're not walking into a trap," he said, his voice low and serious. "I want eyes everywhere. Jax, take point. Diesel, cover the rear. The rest of you stay sharp." The bikers nodded in unison, each one taking their position. Hawk's mind raced as he thought about the situation. They had no idea where the Serpents were hiding the boy or what they were planning, but one thing was clear. They were dealing with a dangerous group, and this could turn violent in an instant. The girl, still holding on to Jax, spoke up again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard them talking," she said, her voice trembling. "They said they were taking him to the old warehouse on the outskirts of town. Please, you have to hurry." Hawk's heart sank. A warehouse. It wasn't far from here, and he knew exactly where it was. It was the perfect place for a gang like the Serpents to hide out, isolated, with no witnesses. "We've got to move," Hawk said. Without another word, the bikers revved their engines and took off once again, their destination now clear. As they neared the warehouse, Hawk's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the tension in the air as the sound of the bikes grew louder. The girl, still holding on to Jax, looked back at Hawk, her eyes wide with fear. "Is he really going to be okay?" she asked. Hawk glanced back at her, his face softening for a moment. "We're going to do everything we can," he said, his voice steady. "Trust us." The warehouse loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the night sky. The bikers pulled into a small parking lot just outside, their motorcycles cutting off the only escape route. Hawk's eyes scanned the building, looking for any sign of movement. He could hear voices from inside, the muffled sound of laughter and shouting echoing through the walls. "Stay here," Hawk said, turning to the others. "Jax, come with me. The rest of you keep watch." Jax nodded, and the two of them slowly approached the entrance of the warehouse, their footsteps muffled by the gravel underfoot. As they got closer, Hawk could hear the faint sound of a child's cry. His stomach turned. It was the boy. They had to get inside, and they had to get in fast. "On three," Hawk whispered to Jax. 1, 2, 3. They kicked open the door, storming into the building with the rest of the bikers right behind them. The Serpents were caught off guard, and the first few moments were chaos. The bikers wasted no time, taking down the guards and securing the area. Hawk's heart raced as he spotted the boy, bound and gagged, sitting in the corner of the warehouse. "We've got him," Jax said, rushing over to free the boy. But just as they reached him, one of the Serpents lunged at Hawk, a knife raised high. The next few moments were a blur. Hawk's reflexes kicked in as he dodged the attack, knocking the Serpent to the ground with a powerful strike. The bikers had the upper hand, and the Serpents quickly realized they were outnumbered. Within minutes, the situation was under control. Hawk approached the boy, who was now free of his restraints. The child looked up at him, tears in his eyes, but there was a sense of relief on his face. "Thank you," the boy whispered, his voice shaky. Hawk nodded. "You're safe now," he said, lifting the boy into his arms. The bikers quickly gathered their crew and made their way out of the warehouse, the sound of their engines roaring as they rode off into the night. The girl's brother was safe, and they had kept their promise. Iron engines thundered down the dark highway, the rhythmic roar of the motorcycles echoing through the night air. Hawk, still holding the boy tightly in his arms, glanced at the rearview mirror, where the other bikers followed closely behind. The mission was a success, but the night was far from over. As the bikes sped down the empty roads, Hawk's mind was still racing, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The boy, now safe but still shaken, sat in front of Jax, his head resting against the taller biker's chest. The girl, who had started this journey, was no longer crying. She sat quietly on the back of another bike, her small hands gripping the vest of her protector. Hawk couldn't help but look at her. The fear in her eyes had faded, replaced by a tiny flicker of hope. She had come to them in desperation, but now, they were bringing her brother home. As they passed the last few houses on the outskirts of town, Hawk could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had made a promise to this little girl's father, a man he had lost years ago in battle. Tyrone's last wish had been for Hawk to watch over his family, and tonight, that promise had been kept. But there was still so much left to do. As the bikers neared their destination, Hawk's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a text from Diesel, one of the bikers who had stayed behind at the warehouse to gather information. "We need to talk," the message read. Hawk's heart sank. It wasn't unusual for Diesel to reach out, but the urgency in his message was enough to make Hawk's stomach twist. "What is it?" he muttered to himself. Jax, sensing his concern, glanced over. "What's wrong?" Hawk looked at Jax, his face hardening. "Something's not right," he said. "We need to stop for a moment." He signaled to the other bikers, and one by one, they slowed their bikes, pulling off to the side of the road. Hawk dismounted and walked a few steps away from the group, pulling out his phone to reply to Diesel's message. As he typed, the weight of the situation settled in. They had just rescued the boy, but Hawk knew the Serpents wouldn't just let this go. They were a dangerous gang, and this was likely just the beginning. Diesel had hinted at something he had discovered about the Serpents' next move, but Hawk didn't have all the details yet. "We can't let our guard down," Hawk said aloud to no one in particular. Jax walked over to him, his face serious. "What are we going to do?" Hawk didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced back at the bikes and then at the boy and girl, both of whom were looking up at him with trust in their eyes. They had risked everything to save them, and now they were on the road, heading home. But home was still miles away, and the Serpents were out there, waiting. Hawk knew they had to keep moving, but he also knew they couldn't ignore the threat looming over them. "We need to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next," Hawk said, his voice calm, but filled with determination. "The Serpents won't stop until they've had their revenge." He turned back to the group, his eyes scanning the horizon. The night had been quiet, but Hawk could feel the tension building. Every biker, every rider, was alert now. They had just fought a battle, but the war wasn't over. Hawk's mind was still racing, but there was no time for hesitation. The boy was safe, for now, but there was still the girl to think about. She had already seen too much, lost too much. Hawk didn't want her to witness any more violence. He didn't want her to be dragged into the world of crime and danger that seemed to follow the Serpents wherever they went. They had to make it home, and they had to do it without attracting attention. As the bikers revved their engines and prepared to continue their ride, Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The Serpents had eyes everywhere, and they wouldn't let this go easily. He glanced back at the boy, who was now clinging to Jax's vest, his eyes wide and innocent. For a moment, Hawk felt a surge of protectiveness. This was more than just a rescue mission. This was about making sure these kids had a future, a chance to escape the darkness that had already taken so much from them. Hawk turned to Jax, his face hardening. "We ride out of here fast, but we keep our eyes peeled," he said. "We don't stop unless we have to." Jax nodded in agreement, and the bikers mounted their bikes once again, the engines roaring to life. As the group sped off into the night, Hawk couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. They were still a long way from safety, and the Serpents were still out there. But for now, all they could do was ride as fast as they could, and pray they could outrun whatever danger lay ahead. The engines continued to rumble, echoing into the quiet night as Hawk and the other bikers pushed forward. The mission was far from over, and they all knew it. They had rescued the boy, but Hawk's gut told him that something was still wrong. The Serpents wouldn't just let this go. They'd come for revenge, and the bikers couldn't afford to be caught off guard. The road ahead stretched on, an endless line of darkness, but it wasn't the road that kept Hawk's eyes sharp. It was the feeling that they were being followed. Every now and then, Hawk would glance in his rearview mirror, watching for any sign of movement. It was the dead of night, but something about the silence felt wrong. As they passed a small diner, the headlights of another car flashed briefly behind them. Hawk's heart skipped a beat, and he signaled to the others to slow down. "Stay close," Hawk muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on the handlebars. Jax, riding just behind him, noticed the change in pace and leaned in closer. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low. Hawk didn't respond immediately. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. "I think we're being followed," he said finally. Jax's expression darkened, and he glanced over his shoulder. "How many?" Hawk didn't answer, his eyes scanning the road behind them. The headlights flickered again, and for a brief moment, Hawk thought he saw the familiar shape of a black SUV. The same SUV the girl had described. The one with the skull and snake eye sticker. "They're still on us," Hawk said, his voice firm. "Keep your eyes peeled. And don't break formation." The bikers adjusted, tightening their formation as they prepared for anything. The road ahead was dark, but they had the advantage of speed, and they wouldn't stop unless they absolutely had to. They needed to get to the safe house, the place where they had planned to meet up with a few of their trusted allies. It was the only place that could offer them some kind of protection against the Serpents. As the group pressed on, Hawk kept glancing back. The headlights were still there, but they weren't getting closer. Maybe the driver was keeping their distance, unsure of how to approach. Or maybe they were waiting for the right moment to strike. Hawk didn't know, but he wasn't about to let his guard down. The safe house was only a few miles away, but with every turn, Hawk felt the tension building. They couldn't afford to be ambushed, not now, not after everything they had been through. As the bikers neared the turn that would take them to the safe house, Hawk noticed the SUV making a move. It had pulled off the main road and onto a smaller side street, clearly trying to cut them off. "Damn," Hawk muttered, his eyes narrowing. "They're trying to flank us." "We've got no choice," Jack said, his voice calm but serious. "We make a run for it." Hawk nodded. He had already made up his mind. They had to get to the safe house, and they had to do it fast. "Follow my lead," he said. Without another word, Hawk kicked the engine into high gear, accelerating down the dark road, the sound of his Harley cutting through the night like a knife. The other bikers followed suit, their engines roaring in unison. The SUV, realizing it had been outpaced, sped up, but it was too late. Hawk and his crew were already ahead, the safe house in sight. As they rounded the final corner, Hawk saw the flicker of lights from the safe house in the distance. They were almost there. They just needed to keep their focus. Hawk felt a sense of relief wash over him as they approached the building, but his instinct told him not to relax just yet. The bikers had barely reached the front gate when they heard the unmistakable sound of tires screeching behind them. The SUV had caught up, and it wasn't backing down. Hawk quickly swung his bike to the side, blocking the gate just as the SUV barreled toward them. He wasn't about to let anyone through. The Serpents had found them, but Hawk wasn't going to let them take what they had worked so hard to protect. The SUV came to a screeching halt just inches from Hawk's bike, and the door flung open. Two men, wearing the telltale colors of the Serpents, stepped out, their faces twisted in anger. "You think you can just walk away from this?" one of them shouted, his voice full of venom. Hawk didn't flinch. "You're not taking anyone else," he said, his voice steady and cold. The standoff was brief, but tense. Hawk could feel the weight of the moment. The Serpents were ruthless, and they didn't give up easily. But Hawk wasn't about to back down. With a quick motion, he signaled to Jax, and the two of them moved into position. The other bikers flanked them, forming a solid wall of leather and steel. The Serpents looked around, realizing they were outnumbered. They hesitated, then quickly retreated, getting back into their SUV. The driver revved the engine, and the vehicle sped off into the night, disappearing into the darkness. Hawk watched them go, his heart still racing. He knew this wasn't the end, but for now, they had won. They had made it to the safe house, and they had protected the boy and the girl. As the bikers dismounted and walked toward the entrance of the safe house, Hawk turned to the others. "We've got work to do," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "We'll keep them safe here, but we're not done. Not yet." The night had been long, but the bikers knew their mission was far from over. The Serpents would return, but they would be ready. The safe house was quiet now, but Hawk could feel the tension in the air. The night had been long, and although the Serpents had retreated, he knew they weren't finished. They never were. Hawk paced back and forth in the small, dimly lit room, his mind racing as he thought about the next move. Jax, who had been standing at the door keeping watch, turned to him. "What's the plan?" Jax asked, his voice low but firm. Hawk stopped, his gaze fixed on the window, as if he could see through the walls and into the darkness beyond. "We can't stay here forever," Hawk said, his voice steady but laced with concern. "The Serpents are going to come back. They'll send more of their people. We need to be ready." The rest of the bikers were scattered around the room, a few cleaning their bikes, others silently talking in hushed tones. The girl and her brother had finally fallen asleep, the weight of the night's events slowly catching up with them. Hawk looked at them, both children now safe for the moment, but he couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. "We'll keep them safe here for now," Hawk continued, turning to face Jax, "but we need a plan. We need to move them somewhere they'll be out of reach, at least until this blows over." Jax nodded in agreement. "We can't leave them unprotected. We've already made too many enemies." Hawk's eyes narrowed. "The Serpents won't stop. They'll want revenge for tonight, and they'll stop at nothing to get it. They know we're here, and they'll come for us, for them." Jax looked over at the children, his face hardening. "We can't let that happen." Hawk took a deep breath and walked over to the table where a map of the area lay spread out. His finger traced the route to a place he knew well, a secluded cabin in the mountains. It was isolated, hard to reach, and most importantly, it was off the grid. "We'll move them there," Hawk said, pointing to the cabin. "It's our best shot at keeping them safe." The bikers gathered around, nodding their agreement. The plan was risky, but it was their only option. "We leave at first light," Hawk said. "We'll be prepared for anything, but we need to move fast. The longer we stay here, the more likely we are to be found." As the bikers made preparations for the journey, Hawk couldn't help but feel a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The Serpents were relentless, and they had made it clear they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. But Hawk was determined to protect the children, to keep his promise to their father. He wasn't going to let them down. The morning came faster than expected, and before the sun had fully risen, the group was packed and ready to go. The engines roared to life once more, and the bikers hit the road, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon, ready for any sign of danger. The roads were quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, like the calm before the storm. As they rode, Hawk's mind kept drifting back to the children. They had been through so much already, and they deserved a chance at a normal life. Hawk would give them that, even if it meant risking everything. The ride took them through winding roads, up into the mountains, the cold air biting at their faces. The view was breathtaking, but Hawk couldn't let himself get distracted. Every turn, every bump in the road, felt like it could be the moment when they were ambushed. They couldn't afford to take any chances. Hours passed, and as they reached the cabin, Hawk felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had made it. The cabin was as secluded as he remembered, hidden deep within the trees, miles away from the nearest town. It was the perfect place to lay low. But Hawk knew they couldn't stay there forever. They needed a plan to deal with the Serpents, and they needed it fast. The bikers dismounted and quickly secured the perimeter, making sure the cabin was safe. Hawk turned to the children, who had been quiet throughout the journey. The girl looked up at him with wide eyes, her face full of gratitude but also fear. "Are we safe here?" she asked softly. Hawk crouched down to her level, his face softening. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "No one's going to hurt you." The boy, who had been quiet for most of the trip, suddenly spoke up. "What happens next?" Hawk looked at the boy, his heart heavy. "We make sure you stay safe," he said. "That's what happens next." The rest of the bikers began setting up camp around the cabin, securing their gear and making sure there was enough food and water for everyone. Hawk stood outside, staring at the distant horizon. He knew the Serpents would find them eventually. It was only a matter of time. But for now, they had a few precious hours of peace. He couldn't afford to waste them. As the day wore on, Hawk gathered the bikers around for a meeting. "We've got to make our move soon," he said. "The Serpents will be looking for us. We can't stay here forever." Jack spoke up, his voice grim. "What's the plan? We can't just keep running." Hawk nodded. "We're not running. We're going to fight. We've got the numbers. We've got the skills. It's time to take the fight to them." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled in. Hawk knew the battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was a fight they had to win. For the children. For their future. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountain range as Hawk stood outside the cabin, his eyes scanning the horizon. The cold wind whispered through the trees, but Hawk didn't feel the chill. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the task ahead. The Serpents weren't far behind, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they came looking for revenge. He had made a promise to the children, to their father, and he wasn't about to let them down. The rest of the bikers were inside the cabin, preparing for what was coming next. Hawk had called a meeting earlier that day, and now everyone was on edge, waiting for his next move. Jax, always by his side, walked up to him, his face serious. What's the plan? Jax asked. Hawk turned to him, his expression resolute. We fight, Hawk said simply. We've been on the run long enough. It's time to take a stand. Jax nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. We've got the numbers, but the Serpents are dangerous. We can't underestimate them. Hawk looked back at the cabin. The children were inside, safe for now, but Hawk knew they couldn't stay there forever. They had to make a move, and they had to do it soon. We need to fortify this place, Hawk said. If the Serpents come, we need to be ready. We'll set up defenses, keep the kids hidden, and make sure they can't get to them. Jax nodded again, already moving to gather the others. Hawk knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed his brothers and sisters in the club. The Iron Riders had faced danger before, but this time it was different. They weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for the future of these children. As the bikers worked to fortify the cabin, Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He stepped outside, his eyes scanning the trees once more. He had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now, something didn't feel right. He moved quickly, checking the perimeter, making sure no one was creeping up on them. The silence of the mountain air felt unnerving, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Hawk took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this one felt different. The Serpents were ruthless, and they had no mercy. If they came for the children, they would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Hawk couldn't let that happen. As night fell, the bikers gathered around a campfire just outside the cabin. The warm glow of the fire cast long shadows on the ground as they shared a quiet meal and discussed their strategy. Hawk looked around at his brothers and sisters in the club. They were more than just a group of bikers. They were family. And right now, that family was all that mattered. We've got one shot at this, Hawk said, his voice steady. We need to make sure we hit them hard and fast. We'll use the terrain to our advantage. The Serpents think they can just roll in and take what they want, but they're wrong. We know these woods better than they do, and we're not going down without a fight. The bikers nodded, their faces hard with determination. They were ready. Hawk stood up and walked over to the edge of the camp, looking out at the distant mountains. The stars were bright against the night sky, but Hawk's mind was still focused on what was to come. He knew the Serpents wouldn't wait long to make their move. They would come, and they would come in force. Hawk needed to be ready. He turned back to the campfire, his eyes meeting Jax's. We'll move out in the morning, he said. We'll keep the kids hidden and get to work. We'll fight them off, and when this is over, they'll know not to mess with us again. Jax nodded and patted him on the shoulder. We've got this, brother, he said. Hawk couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. They had been through a lot together, and they had always come out on top. This time would be no different. As the bikers settled in for the night, Hawk took one last look at the stars above, the weight of the world on his shoulders. But he wasn't alone. He had his family, and they were ready to stand with him. The Serpents might be coming, but they had no idea what they were up against. The morning would bring a new challenge, but Hawk was prepared. For the children, for the future, for his brothers and sisters in the Iron Riders, he would fight. And he would not back down. The first light of dawn began to break over the mountain range, casting long shadows across the ground. Hawk stood at the edge of the camp, his eyes scanning the quiet woods around him. The Serpents would be coming soon. He could feel it. They were closing in, and time was running out. But Hawk had made a promise to the children, to their father, and he wasn't about to break it now. As the bikers gathered around the campfire, preparing for the day ahead, Hawk felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The safe house was no longer safe. The Serpents were out there, and they would come for the children. Hawk had known from the beginning that it wouldn't be easy, but this was worse than he had anticipated. The gang was ruthless, and they didn't care who they hurt. The bikers were ready, but Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that they were outnumbered. He turned to Jax, who was standing beside him, checking his gear. We need to move out fast, Hawk said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. Once we're on the road, there's no turning back. Jax nodded, his expression grim. We'll keep the kids safe, he said. But we need to be smart. The Serpents won't just rush in. They'll have a plan. Hawk looked over at the children, who were still sleeping inside the cabin. The girl's brother was still recovering from the trauma, his face pale but calm. The girl, on the other hand, seemed more alert. She was awake now, her wide eyes watching the bikers as they prepared for the day. Hawk's heart went out to them. They had been through so much already, and now they were relying on him to keep them safe. "We'll get them out of here," Hawk said, his voice low. "But we need to move quickly. The Serpents won't stop until they get what they want." The bikers packed their gear and mounted their bikes, ready for the journey ahead. The engines roared to life as they set off down the mountain road, the cool morning air whipping past them. Hawk led the way, his mind focused on the path ahead. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. As they made their way through the winding roads, Hawk's eyes were constantly scanning the landscape, looking for any signs of movement. The trees and rocks seemed to close in around them, and the further they rode, the more isolated they became. The safe house, now a distant memory, felt like a lifetime ago. They were on their own now, and the only thing that mattered was keeping the children safe. They passed through small towns, their eyes darting nervously at every car they passed, but nothing happened. The road was clear. Hawk allowed himself a brief moment of relief, but it didn't last long. As they turned a corner, Hawk's eyes narrowed. In the distance, he saw a black SUV parked by the side of the road. The same SUV the girl had described. The same SUV that had followed them the night before. "Stay close," Hawk said, his voice firm. "They're here." Jax looked over at him, his face set in determination. "We need to move fast. We can't let them get too close." The bikers revved their engines, speeding up as they continued down the road. The SUV didn't follow immediately, but Hawk knew it was only a matter of time. The Serpents were waiting for the right moment to strike. As the bikers sped down the highway, Hawk's heart raced. The kids were still with them, and they couldn't afford to stop. Hawk knew they had to get to the next town, but with the Serpents closing in, he wasn't sure if they could make it. "We'll take the back roads," Hawk said, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "It's the fastest way to get to safety." The bikers turned onto a narrow dirt road, the sound of their tires crunching against the gravel filling the air. They were cutting through the woods now, their bikes kicking up dust as they moved faster. Hawk could feel the tension building, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth. Every turn they took felt like it could be their last. As they approached a fork in the road, Hawk glanced at Jax. "We split up here," he said. "You take the kids to the safe house. I'll lead the others on the diversion." Jax hesitated, but Hawk could see the trust in his eyes. "Be careful," Jax said, his voice tight with concern. Hawk nodded. "I will. Get them to safety." The bikers split up, with Hawk leading the way down the more treacherous path. The others followed, knowing that their mission was far from over. As Hawk sped down the road, he could hear the distant sound of the SUV following behind them. They were close now, and Hawk's grip tightened on the handlebars. He had to make this count. He glanced back, checking on the others. They were still in formation, but he knew the Serpents wouldn't give up easily. They were coming for the children, and Hawk was going to make sure they didn't get to them. The road ahead was narrow, the trees pressing in on either side, but Hawk kept his focus. Every twist and turn brought them closer to the edge of the mountain, but he wasn't stopping. Not until the kids were safe. Hawk could hear the roar of the SUV's engine getting louder, but he kept pushing forward. The bikers were getting closer to the safe house, and the Serpents were closing in fast. Hawk knew they had to act quickly. He turned to look back at the others, his jaw set in determination. "Get ready," he shouted. This is it. The moment had arrived. The Serpents were closing in, but Hawk and his crew weren't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The roar of the engines was deafening as Hawk and the bikers sped through the winding mountain roads. The Serpents were still on their tail, and the distance between them was closing fast. Hawk's grip tightened on the handlebars, his knuckles turning white as he pushed the bike harder, urging it to go faster. His mind raced, calculating every move, every turn, every possible escape route. The road ahead was narrow, but Hawk knew the terrain like the back of his hand. He had ridden these paths before. But now there was a sense of urgency, a weight pressing down on him that he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes, not with the kids' lives on the line. The SUV was gaining on them, its headlights flashing in the rearview mirror. Hawk could see the men in the front seat, their faces twisted with rage. They were close, too close. Hawk signaled to Jax, who was riding just behind him, to take the kids to the safe house. The plan had always been to separate at this point, but the Serpent's pursuit had changed the timing. Go! Hawk shouted over the roar of the wind. Get them to safety. I'll hold them off. Jax hesitated for a moment, his face set with determination. Be careful, he said, his voice tight with worry. Hawk gave a nod, knowing there was no time to waste. The road ahead was clear for now, but Hawk knew it wouldn't be long before the Serpents made their move. He watched as Jax took the kids down a side trail that led toward the safe house, disappearing into the trees. Hawk didn't have time to worry. The fight was coming, and it was coming fast. As Hawk turned back to face the road, he could feel his pulse racing. The Serpents were getting closer, their SUV now just a few yards behind him. Hawk kicked the bike into a higher gear, pushing it to its limits. The trees rushed past him in a blur, the road twisting and turning as they climbed higher into the mountains. The higher they went, the more dangerous it became. The narrow, rocky path made it hard to outrun the SUV, but Hawk wasn't trying to outrun them. He was trying to set the stage for the fight. He needed the Serpents to get close enough to where they could be ambushed. He had a plan, but it all depended on timing. Hawk's eyes narrowed as he saw the SUV making a move. The vehicle was gaining speed, clearly planning to pass him on the narrow road. Hawk gritted his teeth, knowing that this was the moment. With a quick motion, he jerked the handlebars to the side, sending his bike swerving onto a small side trail. The Serpents' SUV followed, not realizing the trap they were about to walk into. Hawk took a sharp turn, leading the SUV into a narrow, rocky pass surrounded by thick trees. It was the perfect spot. He braked hard, bringing the bike to a sudden stop. The SUV followed, but as it hit the curve, the driver overestimated the road's width and slammed the side into the rocks. The tires screeched, and the vehicle jerked to a stop. Hawk wasted no time. He was already off his bike, pulling out his weapons and moving into position. He knew the Serpents would be out for blood, but they had just walked into a trap. The bikers had prepared the area well. They were hidden in the trees, ready to strike when the moment was right. Hawk moved silently through the brush, keeping his distance from the SUV. The doors of the vehicle flung open, and two of the Serpents emerged, guns in hand. They were looking around, confused, but Hawk didn't give them time to react. He signaled to the rest of the bikers, and within seconds, the Serpents were surrounded. The sound of motorcycles revving filled the air as the bikers emerged from their hiding spots, closing in on the Serpents from all sides. Hawk stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "This is where it ends," he said, his voice cold and steady. The Serpents froze, their hands hovering near their weapons, but they knew they were outmatched. "You came after the wrong people," Hawk continued, his eyes locked on the leader of the Serpents. "And now you're going to pay." The leader of the Serpents gritted his teeth, his eyes filled with fury. "You think you can just walk away from this?" he spat. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with." Hawk stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he said. "And I know what you've done. You're not getting away with it." The tension in the air was thick, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees the only thing breaking the silence. Hawk knew this could turn ugly fast. The Serpents weren't going to back down easily, but the bikers were ready. "Last chance," Hawk said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Leave now, or you won't leave at all." The leader of the Serpents hesitated for a moment, weighing his options. But Hawk could see the uncertainty in his eyes. They were outnumbered, and they knew it. The Serpents weren't used to backing down, but they also weren't stupid. With a grunt of frustration, the leader signaled to his men to retreat. The Serpents climbed back into their SUV, and with one last glare at Hawk, they sped off, disappearing into the forest. Hawk stood still, watching them go. It was over. For now. But he knew this wouldn't be the last time they'd see the Serpents. They were just getting started. As the bikers regrouped, Hawk turned back toward the trail where Jax and the kids had gone. They had made it to safety, but Hawk knew they couldn't rest for long. The Serpents would be back. And this time, they wouldn't be so lucky. Hawk's jaw tightened, but he didn't say a word. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The sound of the engines was almost drowned out by the pounding of Hawk's heart as he rode through the forest, his mind racing. The Serpents had retreated for now, but Hawk knew they wouldn't stay away for long. The woods around him seemed quiet, too quiet, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made him tense. He couldn't let his guard down, not now, not with the children depending on him. Hawk glanced at Jax, who was riding beside him, his face set in grim determination. The safe house was close, but Hawk had a feeling they were being followed. They had been lucky once, But luck didn't last forever. As they made their way down the winding trail, Hawk could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. He had promised to protect the children, and he would keep that promise, no matter what it took. But the serpents were dangerous, and the bikers knew it. Jax leaned in, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We've got to get them to safety," he said. "But we can't keep running forever. What's the plan?" Hawk didn't answer right away. The plan was simple: get the kids to safety and make sure the serpents couldn't find them. But Hawk knew the serpents wouldn't give up that easily. They were ruthless, and if they were determined enough, they would tear this whole place apart to get what they wanted. "We can't run," Hawk said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "We're going to stand our ground. This time we fight." Jax looked at him, his brow furrowed. "Are you sure? We've got the kids with us. If we fight, they'll be in danger." Hawk's eyes narrowed. "If we don't fight, they'll be in danger anyway. The serpents won't stop until they've taken everything from us." The tension in the air was palpable as the bikers continued their ride, the sound of their engines the only noise in the still morning. They had reached the edge of the forest, where the safe house stood hidden in the shadows of the mountains. The place was secluded, the perfect hideout, but Hawk knew it was only a matter of time before the serpents found them. As they pulled up to the cabin, Hawk motioned for the bikers to spread out, keeping watch. He dismounted and walked over to the door, his hand on the handle. The kids were inside, waiting. Hawk didn't know how much longer they could keep them hidden. He had to think of something to buy them more time. As he stepped inside, he was greeted by the sight of the girl and her brother, both of them sitting quietly, looking up at him with wide eyes. The boy looked better, but Hawk could see the fear still lingering in his gaze. The girl was silent, her eyes locked on him, as if waiting for him to tell her what to do next. Hawk didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure what came next, but he knew one thing. He had to keep them safe. "Stay inside," Hawk said softly, his voice gentle but firm. "No matter what happens, you stay here and don't come out." The girl nodded, but the fear in her eyes didn't fade. Hawk could see the weight of everything she had been through. She had lost her family, her home, and now she was relying on them to keep her safe. Hawk's heart ached for her. The boy clung to her, his small frame trembling with fear. Hawk knelt down to their level, his eyes softening. "We're going to make sure you're safe," he said. "You're not alone. We'll protect you." The girl's lips quivered as she looked up at him. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice small. Hawk nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. "I promise." He stood up and turned to Jax, who was standing by the door, his eyes scanning the area. "We've got to prepare," Hawk said, his voice low. "We don't know when they'll show up, but we need to be ready." The bikers moved quickly, setting up defenses around the cabin. Hawk kept watch, his mind racing. He knew the serpents would come, and when they did, they would come in force. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. As the sun began to set, the tension in the air grew. Hawk could feel it, a sense of impending danger hanging over them. They had fortified the cabin as best as they could, but there was no telling how long they could hold out. The serpents were coming. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. Hawk stood outside the cabin, looking out at the forest, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. It was Jax, his face grim. "They're coming," Jax said, his voice low. Hawk nodded, his jaw set in determination. "Let them come. We're ready." The bikers gathered around, taking their positions. Hawk looked at the kids one last time, making sure they were safe inside. The moment of truth was near. The serpents would come for them, but they were ready. Hawk would make sure of it. The tension was palpable as the bikers stood in position, their eyes scanning the forest around the cabin. The sun had set, and the thick shadows of the trees seemed to stretch even further in the dim light. Hawk's senses were on high alert, his every nerve strung tight with anticipation. They had prepared as best as they could, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to keep the serpents at bay forever. They would come, and when they did, they'd come in force. Hawk could feel the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. The children were inside the cabin, safe, for now, but he knew that wasn't a guarantee for long. The serpents didn't stop once they had their sights on something. His mind raced through scenarios, weighing every option, but there was only one thing he could do: hold the line. Jax, always by his side, stepped up beside him, his face grim. "What's the plan now?" Jax asked, his voice calm, but laced with the same tension Hawk was feeling. Hawk's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the surroundings. We hold the perimeter. We keep the kids safe. When the serpents come, we make sure they don't get past us. Jax nodded. Understood. We've got your back. Hawk glanced over at the cabin one last time. The children were in there, sheltered and out of sight. Hawk had made a promise to their father, and that promise meant everything. He wasn't going to let the serpents take them. They had already taken enough. Stay close, Hawk said, his voice firm. If they come, we'll need to move fast. No hesitation. The night was silent, but Hawk knew it wouldn't last. The air felt thick, like something was about to break. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, a reminder that even nature seemed to hold its breath. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of pine and damp earth. Hawk's eyes darted between the trees, every rustle making him tense. It wasn't long before he heard it, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. The serpents had arrived. Hawk's heart skipped a beat as he motioned to the others. Get ready. He could see the headlights of the SUV, now cutting through the darkness, moving steadily toward them. Hawk's jaw clenched, and his fingers tightened around the grip of his weapon. He knew they couldn't let the serpents get any closer. Not now. Not with the kids inside. On my signal, Hawk muttered. The bikers were already in position, ready to fight. Hawk waited for the SUV to get closer, the tension building with every passing second. When the vehicle was just yards away, Hawk's voice cut through the silence. Now, the bikers opened fire, the sound of gunshots shattering the quiet night. The Serpents' SUV swerved, coming to a sudden halt as the men inside scrambled to react. Hawk moved swiftly, his movements calculated, his mind focused on one goal, keeping the children safe. The Serpents weren't going to get through this time. As the bikers moved into position, taking cover behind trees and rocks, Hawk could see the panic in the eyes of the Serpents as they scrambled to get out of the SUV. But they were too late. The Iron Riders had the upper hand. You think you can just take what's ours? Hawk called out to the Serpents, his voice filled with fury. Not today. Not ever. One of the Serpents, a tall man with a scar running down his face, raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Jax was already on him, knocking the gun from his hand and taking him down with a swift move. You're outmatched, Jax said, his voice low but filled with authority. The rest of the Serpents hesitated, realizing they were outnumbered. Hawk stepped forward, his eyes locked on their leader. The leader of the Serpents glared at him, his face twisted in anger. This isn't over, he spat. You'll regret this. Hawk didn't flinch. It's over for you, he said coldly. The Serpents, realizing they had no chance, backed off, climbing into their SUV and speeding away into the night. Hawk watched them go, his chest tight with anger. It wasn't over, but it was a victory. For now. As the sounds of the engines faded into the distance, Hawk turned to Jax. Is everyone okay? Jax nodded. We're good. No one's hurt. Hawk nodded, but his mind was still racing. They had won this battle, but he knew the war wasn't over. The Serpents would be back. They always came back. He couldn't let his guard down. Not now. Not ever. Hawk turned back toward the cabin, where the children were waiting. He hoped they were still safe, that they hadn't heard the gunfire, that they hadn't seen the chaos. But he knew the reality of the world they were now in. A world where danger was never far away. Hawk stepped inside the cabin, his eyes immediately locking onto the children. The girl looked up at him, her face still filled with uncertainty, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. Hawk knelt down in front of her, his expression softening. You're safe, he said, his voice reassuring. The Serpents are gone, and you're safe now. The girl nodded, but the worry in her eyes hadn't faded completely. Hawk could see it. He could see the fear of what might happen next. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder. We'll protect you, he said firmly. We're not going anywhere. The boy, who had been quiet until now, looked up at Hawk, his eyes wide. Will they come back? He asked, his voice small. Hawk took a deep breath, standing up and looking toward the door. I don't know, he said, but we'll be ready. Hawk turned back to the bikers, who had gathered around the campfire, watching them silently. The battle was won, but the war wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Hawk knew the Serpents would return, and when they did, the Iron Riders would be ready to fight again. For now, they had a brief moment of peace, but Hawk's eyes remained sharp, his mind always on alert. The children had made it through the night, but the road ahead was still long and dangerous. The serpents wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, but Hawk would stand in their way, and he would protect the children with everything he had. The morning after the fight was eerily quiet. Hawk sat outside the cabin, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains, his mind still processing the chaos of the night before. The serpents had come, but they had underestimated the Iron Riders. The bikers had fought back, driven by more than just loyalty to each other. They were fighting for the safety of the children, for the future that had been stolen from them. Hawk's thoughts drifted to the kids inside. The girl had been through so much already, and the boy, though young, had already witnessed the violence that seemed to follow them. Hawk clenched his fists, the weight of his promise to their father heavy on his shoulders. He couldn't let them down. The air was crisp, the morning fog lingering over the ground as Hawk stood and walked back toward the cabin. The sounds of the bikers preparing their bikes echoed from the clearing as they geared up for whatever came next. Hawk knew the serpents wouldn't stop after one failed attempt. They'd regroup, come back with more men and more firepower. The question wasn't if they'd come back, it was when. Hawk's focus was interrupted by Jax's voice, calling from the front of the cabin. "You might want to see this," Jax said, his tone urgent. Hawk's stomach tightened as he stepped outside, the weight of the situation becoming even more apparent. The rest of the bikers had gathered around, their faces grim. Hawk approached Jax, who was holding a piece of paper. "What is it?" Hawk asked, his eyes narrowing. Jax handed him the paper. It was a crude map of the area, with a red X marked right over the cabin. "They know where we are," Jax said. "And they're coming back. They've marked our location." Hawk's jaw tightened. He knew the serpents wouldn't stop. They had no mercy. They would keep coming, pushing forward until they had what they wanted. "We don't have much time," Hawk said, folding the map and slipping it into his pocket. "We need to make a decision. Stay here and risk getting trapped, or move the kids and regroup somewhere else." One of the other bikers, a woman named Raven, spoke up. "We can't keep running," she said. "We've been on the move too long, and they'll just keep chasing us. We need to face them head on." Hawk nodded, understanding her frustration. He had felt the same way, but they had to be smart about this. They couldn't afford to fight the serpents without a plan. "We'll hold them off," Hawk said firmly. "But we need a strategy. We're not going to fight blindly. We need to set a trap, draw them in, and take them out before they have a chance to retaliate." Raven nodded, her eyes fierce. "I'll make sure we're ready," she said. "I've got some ideas for fortifications, and we can use the terrain to our advantage." Hawk turned to the others. "Everyone needs to be prepared. We're not just protecting ourselves, we're protecting the kids. And that means we don't back down." The bikers worked quickly, setting up defenses around the cabin and fortifying the entrance. Hawk's mind raced as he thought about the serpents. They had been too close last night. If they were coming back now, they wouldn't waste any time. Hawk needed to make sure they had the upper hand. As the bikers worked, Hawk kept his eyes on the horizon, watching for any signs of movement. He could feel the tension building, his senses heightened as if he could feel the serpents closing in. The children stayed inside, hiding from the chaos outside. Hawk had told them to stay hidden, but he knew the reality. They were never truly safe, not while the serpents were still out there. "We need to move fast," Hawk said as he approached Jax, who was helping to secure the bikes. "They'll be here soon." Jax gave a grim nod. "We're ready. Let's do this." Hawk turned to face the group of bikers. "We're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. We're fighting for their future, for their chance at a life free from fear." The bikers mounted their bikes, engines revving in unison as they prepared for the fight ahead. Hawk's mind was focused, his thoughts clear. The serpents wouldn't know what hit them. As the bikers rode out, Hawk could feel the adrenaline building. They were going to make their stand here, in the woods, where they had the advantage. They knew the terrain, the twists and turns of the narrow roads, and they would use every advantage they had. Hawk led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. The serpents were coming, but they would regret thinking they could take on the Iron Riders. They would regret underestimating them. As they rode through the forest, Hawk couldn't help but glance back at the cabin. The kids were safe, for now, but Hawk knew they wouldn't be able to stay hidden for long. The serpents would find them again, and next time, Hawk would make sure they wouldn't get away. The bikers were ready, and Hawk was prepared to do whatever it took to protect the children. The battle was far from over, but they would fight, and they would win. The air was thick with tension as the bikers prepared for what was sure to be their hardest fight yet. Hawk's mind was focused, the weight of the responsibility heavier than ever. The Serpents were coming back, and this time, they were coming with everything they had. There was no turning back now. The Iron Riders were ready for the battle ahead, but Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His instincts were telling him that the Serpents had more up their sleeves than just a few men and weapons. As they rode through the dense forest, the sound of their engines was deafening, cutting through the quiet morning. Hawk looked back at Jax, his second-in-command, who was riding just behind him. Jax's face was set in determination, his eyes scanning the terrain for any sign of movement. "We've got one shot at this," Hawk said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "We make it count. The kids are counting on us. We're not just fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for them." Jax nodded, his jaw tightening. "We'll do whatever it takes." Hawk's gaze turned back to the road ahead. The Serpents had made their move, and now it was their turn. They couldn't afford to hesitate. As they neared the clearing where they had set up their trap, Hawk's heart pounded in his chest. The plan had been simple: lead the Serpents into the narrowest part of the forest, where they could use the terrain to their advantage. Once the Serpents were in position, the bikers would strike. The trap had to work, and Hawk knew that it had to be done with precision. The tension was unbearable as the bikers set up, taking their positions behind rocks and trees. Hawk could hear the sound of an engine in the distance. The Serpents were close. He motioned for the others to be ready. "This is it," Hawk said. "Stay sharp, and don't let them through." The sound of the approaching SUV grew louder, and Hawk's grip tightened on the handlebars. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the area. The Serpents were getting closer. The engines roared, and the SUV came into view, barreling down the narrow trail. Hawk's heart raced as he watched them approach, every instinct telling him to wait just a little longer. "Now!" Hawk shouted, and in that instant, the bikers sprang into action. The Serpents were caught off guard as the bikers emerged from their hiding places, surrounding the SUV in an instant. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire, and Hawk could see the panic in the Serpents' eyes. They had walked right into their trap. The leader of the Serpents, a man with cold, calculating eyes, scrambled to grab his weapon, but it was too late. Hawk was already on him, disarming him with a quick, practiced move. "You came to the wrong place," Hawk said, his voice low and steady. The leader glared at him, but Hawk wasn't intimidated. "You don't get to take what's ours," he continued, his eyes filled with fury. The other bikers were handling the rest of the Serpents, pushing them back and keeping them contained. The fight was chaotic, but the Iron Riders had the advantage. They knew the terrain, and they knew how to fight as a team. It didn't take long before the Serpents were overwhelmed, their attempts to fight back futile against the skilled bikers. Hawk didn't take his eyes off the leader, who was now on his knees, hands raised in surrender. "You've lost," Hawk said, his voice cold. "And now, you'll pay for what you've done." The leader of the Serpents sneered, but Hawk could see the fear in his eyes. He had underestimated the Iron Riders, and now it was too late to turn back. "Get them out of here," Hawk ordered, motioning to the other bikers. "Take them back to the safe house." The rest of the Serpents were quickly subdued and tied up, their weapons taken, their escape routes cut off. Hawk turned back to the cabin, his heart still pounding. The kids were safe, for now, but Hawk knew this wouldn't be the end of it. The Serpents would be back. They always came back. As the bikers gathered their prisoners and prepared to leave, Hawk walked toward the cabin, his mind racing. He couldn't let his guard down. Not now. Not with everything at stake. He pushed open the door, his eyes immediately locking onto the children. They were sitting quietly, waiting for him, their faces filled with a mix of fear and hope. Hawk knelt down in front of them, offering a reassuring smile. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe now." The girl looked up at him, her eyes still filled with uncertainty. "But what about them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hawk took a deep breath, standing up and looking toward the door. "We'll deal with them," he said. "But for now, you're safe. That's all that matters." The boy looked up at him, his small face filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. Hawk's heart clenched. He had done his job, but the battle wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The Serpents were defeated for now, but they would return. And Hawk would be ready. He had made a promise, and he wasn't going to break it. Not while he still had breath in his lungs. The quiet after the storm felt surreal. Hawk stood outside the cabin, looking out over the treeline, his mind still racing, yet oddly calm. The Serpents had been taken care of, for now. The bikers had held their ground, protecting the children and sending the message that the Iron Riders were not to be messed with. But even in the aftermath of victory, Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that the war wasn't over. He had kept his promise to the children, but he knew the Serpents would be back. That was the nature of people like them, relentless, unforgiving. Hawk's thoughts were interrupted by Jax walking up to him, his face worn but resolute. "What now?" Jax asked, his voice low but filled with respect. Hawk turned to him, his gaze steady. "We stay prepared," he said simply. "We make sure the kids are safe, and we keep an eye on the horizon. The Serpents will regroup, but we'll be ready." Jax nodded, understanding that this wasn't just about today. It was about tomorrow, and the next day, and the one after that. Hawk had led them through this battle, but it was only the beginning of the war. "I'll get the crew ready," Jax said, his tone serious. "We need to stay sharp." Hawk watched him walk back to the other bikers, each of them carrying the weight of what had just happened. The kids were safe inside, for now, but Hawk knew it wouldn't be long before they'd need to move again. They had a place to go, an old house far from here, but it was still a few days' ride away. "Stay with me for a minute," Hawk said, turning back to the cabin. He pushed open the door and walked inside. The girl and her brother were sitting on the couch, looking more at ease than they had since this whole nightmare began. The girl's eyes were still wide, her face still carrying the burden of everything she had witnessed. The boy, though, seemed calmer now, his body no longer trembling, and his eyes less filled with fear. Hawk could see that they were starting to trust him. He wasn't sure if it was the promise he had made or the actions he had taken, but they seemed to be starting to believe they were safe. Hawk sat down in front of them, his expression softening. "How are you holding up?" he asked the girl, his voice gentle but firm. She didn't answer at first, just looked down at the floor, but then she met his eyes. "I'm scared," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hawk nodded, his heart aching for her. "It's okay to be scared," he said quietly. "But you're safe now. I'm not going to let anything happen to you." The girl looked up at him, searching his face for sincerity, and for the first time in days, she seemed to find it. She nodded slowly. Hawk turned to the boy, who was still holding the girl's hand. "You too. You're safe here," he said. The boy looked up at him, his face serious but trusting. "Are you going to make them go away for good?" he asked. Hawk's heart sank at the innocence in his voice. "I'll make sure you're safe," Hawk replied, his voice unwavering. "But we have to be ready. The world isn't always safe, but we'll make sure it's as safe as we can." The boy didn't ask any more questions. Instead, he leaned against his sister, both of them silent for a long moment. Hawk got up, walking toward the door, but not before he turned back to look at them one last time. "Rest now," he said softly. "You deserve it." The night was still, and for a moment, Hawk allowed himself to breathe, but he didn't let his guard down. He knew better than to believe the danger was over. He had seen too many battles, too many enemies who would come back, again and again, until they were stopped for good. As he stepped outside, the cold night air bit at his face, and Hawk looked toward the horizon. The Serpents would be back. That was a certainty, but they would not find the Iron Riders unprepared. They would stand their ground, protect the innocent, and ensure that the children, and all who sought refuge, would never again live in fear. The bikes were lined up, ready to go, and the rest of the crew was already preparing to move. Hawk turned to Jax, who was already waiting for him. "Let's go," Hawk said. "We've got work to do." The engines roared to life, the sound echoing through the empty woods. Hawk looked back at the cabin one last time. They weren't leaving forever, but it was time to move on. For the children, for their safety, and for the promise Hawk had made. The fight wasn't over, but the Iron Riders would fight until the end. And as long as they had each other, they would never lose. In this gripping tale of survival and loyalty, the Iron Riders, a fearless biker gang, fight to protect innocent lives from the relentless Serpents, a ruthless gang determined to destroy everything in their path. As the bikers face off against dangerous enemies, they must hold their ground to safeguard two children who have already lost everything. Hawk, the leader of the Iron Riders, made a promise to protect these children after their father's death, and he will stop at nothing to keep them safe. The story unfolds with intense action, emotional moments, and a bond between the bikers that shows the true meaning of family and sacrifice. This thrilling chapter of Hell Angel Stories delves into the dangerous world of these warriors on two wheels, where they ride to protect the innocent and fight for justice. As the Serpents close in, Hawk and his crew prepare for a showdown, their resolve strengthening with every challenge they face. The Hell Angel Stories come alive as the bikers set a trap for their enemies, using their knowledge of the terrain and their skill in combat to turn the tide of battle. With each passing moment, the tension builds, culminating in a dramatic battle that will determine the fate of the children and the future of the Iron Riders. In the end, the bikers emerge victorious, but Hawk knows this victory is only temporary. The Serpents will be back, but the Iron Riders are ready. With the children now safe, Hawk and his crew ride on, knowing the fight for justice is far from over. In this high-stakes chapter of Hell Angel Stories, loyalty, courage, and the bonds of family are tested as the bikers stand strong against the forces of evil. The world may be full of danger, but as long as the Iron Riders are around, they will keep fighting to protect the helpless, and the Hell Angel Stories will continue to inspire bravery in the face of darkness.